When a North Carolina woman is found dead in her home, investigators realize that what initially appeared to be a suicide is in fact a staged murder scene. A family waits for justice while a suspect inherits the victim's estate in this episode of Last Seen Alive. Thanks for listening to Last Seen Alive. I'm your host, Leah, crime analyst by day and true crime storyteller by night.
And as always, I'm your co-host, Scott.
A quick heads up. This episode contains discussion of suicide and domestic violence. Please listen with care. And with that being said, this case was brought to our attention by a listener who wishes to remain anonymous. Thanks for the suggestion, Anonymous. We appreciate it. Scott, we're 1 month into our new every week release schedule now, and I think it's going pretty well.
Yeah, I'd say so.
It's a change of pace for us and a lot of work, especially since we're balancing it with other things like our family and my full-time work as a crime analyst. We've had some help, though, from Magic Mind. Magic Mind is a mental performance shot designed to help achieve mental clarity and focus with ingredients like organic ceremonial-grade Japanese matcha and organic California-grown lion's mane and cordyceps mushrooms. Scott, you and I just finished a 7-day wellness shot challenge together, and we both really liked Magic Mind.
Yeah, it really helped me focus.
Same here. I saw a lot of benefit taking the shot right when I sit down to research and write these episodes. It helped me feel calm and focused and to really get into the zone with my writing. It's a no-crash mental boost, and you can enjoy it alongside your morning coffee or on its own. Plus, you can feel good about knowing that Magic Mind donates a portion of their proceeds to mental health charities. Because Magic Mind is sponsoring this episode, you have a limited offer you can use now that gets you up to 48% off your first subscription or 20% off a one-time purchase with code LSA at checkout. You can claim it at magicmind.com/LSA. The link's in the show notes. We really enjoy Magic Mind, and we really appreciate them sponsoring this episode and supporting us in getting this important story out there. This story is one that received a good deal of media coverage when it occurred a decade ago, but since then, things have fallen oddly silent. Despite some very compelling evidence implicating a person who police have openly admitted that they consider a suspect. Sarah Long was last seen alive on July 18, 2014. She was 41 years old at the time and lived in Davidson, North Carolina. Davidson is a suburb of Charlotte, home to about 15,000 people and situated on the edge of Lake Norman. It's a nice place to live, and not just because of the lake. Crime rates are low compared to the rest of the state. As you've likely already guessed based off of the low crime rate alone, household incomes are higher, on average, than in the rest of the state and the rest of the country. People are rarely murdered or robbed or even assaulted in Davidson, which makes what happened to Sarah that much more shocking. Sarah worked a corporate job in nearby Mooresville at the Lowe's Home Improvement corporate office. She worked as a buyer, and it was a good job, allowing her to afford a townhome not far from the shore of Lake Norman. And at the time of her death, she was still legally married. However, she and her husband had separated and were no longer living together. Although Sarah had been living in North Carolina for decades by the time of her death, she'd grown up on a farm in rural Kentucky. She had a soft spot for animals, and those who knew her describe her as someone who was always fun to be around. The last person to see Sarah alive, that we know of, was a neighbor. Living in a townhome, she had dozens of neighbors, and one of them later told police they'd last seen her on Saturday, July 19th. However, police didn't receive any sort of indication that something might be wrong until several days later, on July 23rd, when someone who knew Sarah called police to report that they hadn't heard from her in 4 days and to ask police to perform a welfare check.
Always a smart idea if you're used to seeing somebody or communicating with them and they drop off suddenly.
Yeah, if you can't get in touch and you think something might be wrong, better safe than sorry. After receiving the call, the Davidson Police Department dispatched officers to Sarah's address. When they knocked, no one came to the door. When they made entry, however, they found Sarah. They found her body in her bedroom, on her bed, and it was clear not only that she was deceased, but that she had been for days. At first glance, the scene appeared to be a suicide. Sarah had an obvious traumatic head wound, and there was a gun in her hand. However, under scrutiny, the illusion of suicide quickly unraveled. There were details, many of them, that just didn't add up. For starters, the gun in Sarah's hand was a .357 revolver. And a .357 cartridge is not a small one.
No.
So, Scott, you're knowledgeable about firearms, more knowledgeable than me. So can you explain more about this caliber of ammunition, like what it's typically used for, and how powerful it is compared to other popular handgun cartridges that listeners might be familiar with, like a 9mm?
Yeah. So I had to look up to make sure some of my facts were right, but just to very basic size differences, the overall length for the .357 Magnum is about 40 millimeters or 1.6 inches. And the overall length for a 9mm is about 1.1 or 30 millimeters.
Okay, so it's a significantly larger cartridge for starters.
Yes. So you're getting muzzle velocities around 1,400 feet per second for the .357 versus a little bit over 1,000 to 1,200 feet per second based off of the 9mm.
Okay, so with a .357 versus the ever popular 9mm, the .357 cartridge is a lot larger, it's traveling a lot faster, and that's definitely going to lead to a more devastating wound, right?
Yeah, and one thing to keep in mind is the bullet diameters, they're very similar. So with a 9mm, you're looking at 0.355 inches for the diameter of the bullet, and a .357 is aptly named. It's 0.357, so it's 2/1000th of an inch bigger. So they're very similar bullets, but you have an entire 10 millimeters of space difference for powder and to push up that muzzle energy. So when talking about suicide, you're talking about a very close to the body bullet.
Yes.
So I think one of the most important things when we're talking about suicide is probably muzzle energy. And the muzzle energy is about 300 or so foot-pounds for the 9mm versus about 400, 450 for the .357. So you're getting an extra 100 pounds of energy to be pushed into whatever you may be shooting.
Okay, so it's pretty clear. There is a lot of power behind a .357 cartridge, and therefore there's going to be a good deal of recoil when a .357 revolver is fired, right?
Yeah, and when we're talking about that energy, one thing to keep in mind is that the 9mm is a very capable self-defense round for use on other humans in a defensive situation.
Yeah, it's very popular for that purpose.
Military, law enforcement agencies, it's one of the most popular handgun rounds because of its small size and its light recoil.
Right.
But the .357, I know a number of people that have deer hunted with it, bear hunted with it. It's a very popular round for carrying into the woods for defense against larger animals.
Okay, I think that really puts it into perspective. So this cartridge that can potentially take down a bear, there's a lot of power behind it, and therefore there's going to be a good deal of recoil when a .357 revolver is fired, right?
Yes, and to that point, I know a lot of people that have it, they can fire a much lighter recoiling round called the .38 Special, which is an old police round. They can target practice with that because it carries less powder, but it's the same diameter bullet. So they like to target practice with that so they don't hurt their wrist as much with the .357.
Right. So this is a firearm with so much recoil that it could hurt an average adult male's wrist just to fire it, potentially.
Potentially. It's not like a massive round where you're thinking like you're seeing videos of people get knocked back from the recoil of it. It's not a 500 Magnum, but it's uncomfortable.
Okay, so I'm just trying to paint a picture here of the power that would be behind this cartridge.
It's not going to be something that's pleasant.
Especially if you're someone like Sarah. She was a small, very slender, middle-aged woman. Now, given all that, consider this. When officers found Sarah's body, which again was lying in a supine position on her bed, the hand she was holding the revolver in was resting on the center of her chest, despite the fact that she'd been shot just above the ear and the left side of her head.
Okay, so a few things stand out there. I'm guessing she was probably right-handed?
Yes, she was.
Even if she were to do it on the right side of her head, which is the most likely, in my opinion, that she would do it.
Yeah, probably.
It would still not be resting neatly on her chest.
No, I would expect the hand to fly off to the side, for the gun to leave the hand and probably wind up on the bed or the floor.
I mean, that's very common with even smaller handguns. When you're talking about a unusual shooting position like that, you're not putting the revolver in line with your body to absorb that recoil.
Right.
You're going to have it off to the side. I'm going to say there's a very high probability that it's leaving the hand.
Yes, I think it's safe to say that you consider it just as extremely unlikely as I do that someone could fire a .357 cartridge into the left side of their own head and somehow have their hand end up resting neatly on their own chest, still clutching the gun in death.
I don't say things are impossible very often, but that is about as close to impossible as I would put it, especially when we consider the fact that it is not her dominant or strong hand.
Yeah, let's err on the side of caution here and call that virtually unthinkable.
Yes.
Okay. Naturally, police, who understand everything we just discussed, were also suspicious. And later on in the investigation, Scott, they discover another odd detail which you already brought up. Sarah was right-handed. So not unthinkable that someone could use their left hand in an act like this, but, unlikely. And when given all the other details, it all just is very unlikely. But you know what, Scott?
What?
Those aren't even the only suspicious observations when it comes to the placement of the gun in Sarah's hand. There's another highly improbable detail.
Okay.
Dare I say, virtually unthinkable. Sarah's left hand, the hand she was holding the gun in, was completely clean. As in, there was no blood spatter or blood on it at all. Not visibly, and also a medical examiner closely examined her hand during autopsy and could find no trace of blood whatsoever. Scott, there's another important detail in the autopsy findings that I want to mention. According to reporting by Steve Helling for People.com, the medical examiner was unable to determine whether or not the gunshot wound to Sarah's head had been what had actually killed her. Yes, she had been shot in the head, that was abundantly clear, but she may already have been deceased when the gunshot wound was inflicted. No one knows for sure.
Okay, that's fairly interesting. Not to get too graphic here, but a .357 at point blank range, that's going to cause significant trauma.
Absolutely. And on top of that, by the time Sarah's body was discovered, she'd been deceased for several days, so decomposition was well underway. Presumably, that may also have impacted the medical examiner's ability to determine the cause of her death, and I'm not really surprised that they couldn't determine it for sure.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Obviously, when you're trying to figure out that and there is so much trauma.
Right. Between the catastrophic traumatic damage to the body and the process of decomposition, we're talking about a lot of soft tissue loss and a lot of evidence loss, potentially.
Yeah.
Anyway, what I'm ultimately saying here, Scott, is that there was overwhelming evidence that the scene had been staged. Someone who does not appear to have been a genius had arranged the scene to try to make it look as if Sarah had taken her own life, presumably in an effort to conceal the fact that they had actually murdered her. The big question is, of course, who would want to kill Sarah and why? As I mentioned, Sarah had an ex-husband who she'd separated from. So, Scott, I have a feeling you're probably wondering about him. Because, as we have so often said on this show, women who are in abusive relationships are in more danger of being killed after leaving the relationship, specifically during the 12-month post-breakup period, than they are during the actual relationship itself.
It is a statistic that I have etched in my brain at this point.
Yeah, we know it to be true, and I'm sure most of our listeners do too. Now, normally, this is the part where I'd add a little disclaimer stating that I don't know whether the victim in question had been involved in an abusive relationship or not. However, in this case, there is some indication that Sarah's relationship with her ex-husband, Christopher Reeves, not the celebrity Christopher Reeves, of course, just a guy who happened to have the same name, may have involved some abuse.
Yeah, normally if you don't include that, my mind obviously goes to you have seen something that would point you in the other direction.
Right, and that something is, according to reporting by Joe Marosak for the Herald Online, Sarah filed a domestic violence charge against her husband, Christopher, about 5 months before her death, around the time of their separation. However, she chose not to go through with prosecution, resulting in the charge being dropped just weeks later. About 4 months after the charge was dropped, she was dead. And sure, that may sound suspicious, but Scott, what if I told you that Sarah's ex-husband, Christopher, is, at most, a distant secondary character when it comes to the suspicion surrounding her case?
I'm actually kind of surprised by this.
Yeah, it's true though. In fact, about 2 years after Sarah's death, Davidson Police Department Lieutenant Steve Ingram told WBTV News that Christopher, quote, has been excluded as a person of interest, end quote. So investigators are confident that Christopher was not responsible for Sarah's death, which means there's another man we need to discuss, and his name is William Drew Becker. He's the person who called police, telling them he hadn't heard from Sarah in days and asking them to conduct a welfare check. He was also Sarah's boyfriend at the time of her death.
How the turntables.
Right.
Him being the boyfriend does point him as a potential suspect.
Sure. Now, Becker was in his early 50s at the time of Sarah's death and owned a trucking company. He and Sarah had been dating for just a few months. In addition to being the person who'd contacted police asking for a welfare check to be conducted, he was also the last known person to be seen with Sarah. Investigators determined that when they spoke to Sarah's neighbors, who, according to reporting by Stephanie Slifer for CBS News, told investigators that they saw Sarah and Becker entering her townhome together on the night of July 19th. That was the last time Sarah was seen alive. Another neighbor didn't see Sarah that night, but she did hear something. According to reporting by Alexa Ashwell for WSOC-TV, that neighbor heard what she described as a loud slam coming from Sarah's townhome that night.
Okay, I was starting to question that in my mind, thinking about the fact that their townhomes, they're side by side, and having lived in some, they're not the thickest of walls.
Usually not. I'll go ahead and say that her townhome on the lake was nicer than townhomes we have lived in the past. But again, I'm not sure how well insulated the walls were. I don't know how close this neighbor's unit was to Sarah's, but she heard something, and it was very loud and noticeable.
Either way, I'm going to go ahead and say that was probably around the time she was shot.
I would not be surprised. And keep in mind, this is not a high crime area. The people who live here, these are not people living in poverty. They're not used to a lot of violent crime having around them. If they hear a loud bang, their first thought is probably not going to be, oh, I bet that was a gun. Anyway, naturally, investigators questioned Becker, and when he spoke about Sarah, he was quick to paint a portrait of a woman in despair. Sarah, he told investigators, had been diagnosed with cervical cancer shortly before her death. The blow had come, Becker claimed, on the heels of Sarah's separation with her ex-husband, who, quote, was known to be physically and emotionally abusive to her, end quote. That quote comes from an affidavit which journalist Joe Marusak wrote about in his article on this case. And it's according to Becker.
Okay, so obviously an autopsy could have verified that.
Oh, the cancer? Yes. So, poor Sarah, Becker explained to investigators, had really been put through the ringer by life. It had been too much for her to cope with. In the wake of the cancer diagnosis, she'd become suicidal. Becker knew because, according to what he told investigators, according to that affidavit, there had been subtle signs, things that perhaps only an emotionally attuned partner would pick up on. Things like an incident that had occurred a month before her death in which she had produced a gun, held it to her own head and declared, quote, "Sometimes I just feel like blowing my head off," end quote. The problem with this theory, though, Scott, is that Sarah hadn't actually been diagnosed with cervical cancer or any other type of cancer, and it didn't even take the medical examiner to determine this. It was easier than that. Investigators spoke with Sarah's physician, who denied any sort of cancer diagnosis or cancer history. He told investigators that actually he'd diagnosed Sarah with some atypical cells on her cervix. Atypical, but not cancerous. And this is a pretty common diagnosis, and the concern with atypical cells is that they could potentially develop into cervical cancer eventually, maybe over time if left untreated. Fortunately, the abnormal cells could be removed with a quick outpatient procedure. Sarah was well aware of this. In fact, she'd actually had the procedure done before for the same reason. So this was not a life-changing diagnosis for her. And again, she had not been diagnosed with cancer. As for the rest of Becker's claims, the accusations against Sarah's ex and the story about the gun, well, I have no way of technically knowing for certain whether or not they're true, but considering the fact that Becker made up a fake cancer diagnosis, I don't put any stock in anything that he has said or will ever say. Once someone has lied about cancer, their credibility is as microscopic as an abnormal cervical cell at best, and maybe that's being generous.
I'd say that's being pretty generous.
Now, as wild as that was, though, the suspicion surrounding Becker neither begins nor ends with that big lie. Not even close. There's a whole lot more to consider when it comes to Becker. like the fact that he had an alleged history of trying to harm at least one other woman in his life with a poisoned smoothie. More on that next. And now, back to Sarah's story. After 41-year-old Sarah Long was found dead in her apartment, it didn't take long for investigators to determine that someone had staged the scene of her death as a suicide. It also didn't take them long to determine that her boyfriend, William Drew Becker, who she'd been dating for a few months by the time of her death, was a pretty shady guy. In addition to the cancer lie investigators caught Becker in, there was the alleged poisoned smoothie incident. About 2 months prior to Sarah's death, Becker's wife, yes, he was married while dating Sarah, filed a restraining order against him. Here's what allegedly led her to do so. She was going about her business one day when Becker brought her a smoothie. Perhaps this seemed like a thoughtful gesture, but when Becker's wife took a sip of the smoothie, she immediately noticed something was off. There was a distinct bitter taste that defied the flavor profile of any known fruit or other smoothie ingredient. So she asked her husband, "Is there medicine in this?" And Scott, do you know what Becker's response was?
No, what is it?
Well, he didn't say anything. He just snatched the smoothie out of his wife's hand, made a beeline for the bathroom, dumped the entire thing into the toilet, and flushed. Vigorously, I would imagine.
Yeah, that doesn't sound like somebody that's thought any of this through.
No. According to reporting for WBTV, later, Becker admitted to his wife that yes, the smoothie had contained medicine, a sleep aid, which he'd blended into the beverage in an effort to help her rest. How thoughtful. Less than a week after this incident, Becker's wife filed a restraining order against him, understandably. The alleged poisoned smoothie incident is concerning Scott for reasons beyond the obvious. According to the same WBTV article, Becker told investigators that on the day of Sarah's death, he had brought her 2 things, toilet paper and a chocolate milkshake. He also claimed that Becker had taken some sleeping pills of her own accord.
Of course.
When investigators searched Sarah's apartment, among other things, they found, quote, Nesquik chocolate drink mix powder, a spoon, and a Chapel Hill mug with a plastic straw, end quote. So it sounds like the milkshake may have been homemade.
Yeah, this is really causing some concern.
Yeah, Scott, remember how I mentioned that the medical examiner was unable to determine whether or not Sarah actually died from the gunshot wound to her head or had already been deceased when she'd been shot?
That was immediately where my mind jumped to.
Yeah, I think the milkshake thing raises the question. Might Becker have drugged Sarah, sedating her so that he could kill her without risking her fighting back? Did he wait until she fell asleep to shoot her or to kill her in some other way, perhaps strangulation or suffocation, before shooting her in an effort to make her homicide look like a suicide?
A very poorly staged suicide.
Yeah, it's a question that I think anyone hearing this story would naturally ask, and I'm sure it's a question that investigators have asked themselves as well. According to reporting by Joe Marusak for the Charlotte Observer, investigators say that although Becker has yet to be charged in relation to Sarah's murder, he is a suspect.
Okay.
During the course of their investigation, investigators had collected Sarah's computer and wireless router from her home and had also gained access to her email account and bank records. All of this, especially the router, had played an important role in identifying their suspect. Still, there's something significant we haven't discussed yet, and that's motive. Sure, it's not difficult to imagine why Becker might have attempted to poison his wife. After all, he was having an affair. Maybe he wanted out of the marriage and thought that smoothie-facilitated homicide would be preferable to divorce. He certainly would not be the first person to kill a spouse because they'd met someone new. But what about Sarah, his new girlfriend of just a few months? Why would he want to kill her?
Well, just connecting some dots here, I'm assuming there was some new or recently manufactured will that gave him access to her property based off of what you said in the intro.
You have hit the nail on the head. Between her townhome, which she owned, her investments, and her savings, Sarah's net worth totaled just under $1 million. Like you said, one would wonder, what are the odds of a new boyfriend seeing much or any of that money in the event of her death? They'd only been dating for a few months. Plus, Sarah was still legally married and had other close family members, including her father and siblings. But guess what? Scott, like you guessed, shortly before her death, Sarah had written up a will that left everything to her boyfriend of just a few months, Becker. According to Joe Marusak's reporting, Becker told investigators that the will had been her idea. He said that she'd wanted both of them to have wills, quote, because something might happen to one of them and because she was afraid of what her husband might do, end quote.
Again, that's him saying this.
Yeah, which is weird considering that Sarah and Becker were not financially dependent upon each other. Their finances were not entangled, and if something happened to one of them, it wouldn't impact the other financially. They'd literally only been together for a few months, didn't live with each other, and were both married to other people. Plus, if Sarah hadn't wanted any of her assets to go to her husband, she could simply have willed them to another close family member.
Yeah, that makes way more sense.
Yeah, she had numerous loved ones, and naturally, investigators doubted Becker's explanation, and so did others, like Sarah's family. According to her dad and brother John, it was incomprehensible that Sarah would willingly leave her estate to someone outside of the family, especially someone she hadn't known for long. Sarah had a good deal of money tucked away, and she'd always been really careful with it. She had inherited most of it from her mom, so it was really meaningful to her, and she'd always said that she wanted to keep the money in the family. According to an affidavit, Sarah had told her family that she eventually wanted to use the money to buy the family farm in Kentucky where she'd grown up and where her dad still lived. He was getting older, and Sarah wanted to relieve him of the responsibility of the farm so he could live comfortably.
That's a very admirable claim.
Definitely. So the idea that Sarah would just throw away that dream and give her entire estate to someone she'd basically just met was unthinkable to her family. They didn't believe that Sarah had voluntarily created the will that left everything to Becker, and they tried to prevent Becker from receiving the money through the court system, but they were unsuccessful. All of Sarah's money and assets, approximately $1 million worth, which she'd so carefully saved, would leave the family. Worse, it would go to a man who was considered a suspect in her murder.
My mind naturally jumps to, did she have any knowledge of this will even existing?
I don't know, and unfortunately, I don't think we'll ever know. Now, there was another person who contested the will in court, and that person was Christopher, Sarah's legal husband, from whom she was separated but still technically married to. He went to the courts asserting that he deserved at least 15% of Sarah's estate.
I mean, that is
a pretty modest slice, really.
Yeah, that's very modest considering what most former spouses would go for.
Yeah. Ultimately, Christopher and Becker ended up settling out of court. Christopher did get a share of the estate, but it's not publicly known how much. They kept that private. In any case, Sarah was gone, her entire future erased, likely because someone had wanted the money she'd carefully saved. And the suspect named by police, Becker, was living freely, spending that money. Unfortunately, and perhaps unsurprisingly, Becker went on to hurt other women in his life. In 2017, so about 3 years after Sarah's death, Becker found himself back in court. Not civil court, where he'd fought to keep Sarah's money, but criminal court this time. He'd been charged with concerning crimes in 2 separate offenses which had involved 2 separate female victims. Neither of these women were Becker's wife, who he'd allegedly tried to drug with a smoothie. Now, Scott, I don't know for certain, but I assume and I certainly hope that she had distanced herself thoroughly and permanently from her husband by this point.
I mean, she's already got every red flag going for her. Logically, she would get as far away from him as possible.
Right, and an article for the Charlotte Observer refers to her as his former wife, so clearly they had definitely divorced by this point in time. However, Becker quickly moved on, finding other women to date and to target. In 2016, he was charged with 3 separate crimes against one woman, including communicating threats, simple assault, and felony assault by strangulation. That last crime, strangulation, is of particular concern. We've talked about it in previous episodes, but I never want to miss an opportunity to say that strangulation is an extremely serious crime that, statistically speaking, indicates that the victim is at an elevated risk of being killed by their abuser in the future.
Yeah, 100%. Every time this is brought up, people need to know this. We've gone to training specifically for this.
Right. According to scientific studies published in peer-reviewed journals, such as the Journal of Emergency Medicine, women who are strangled by their partners are more than 7 times more likely to be seriously hurt or killed by their partners than women who are abused but not strangled. Again, that 7 times more likely figure is comparing women who are abused and strangled to women who are abused, just not strangled. So you can imagine how much higher the 7 times more likely to be killed figure would be if we were comparing abused and strangled women to non-abused women.
My mind always goes back to that training I mentioned just a minute ago. And how the trainer, who was very well qualified in the field,
yes,
said that it is the most important pre-violent or pre-murderous indicator.
And they were right. The bottom line is, if you or someone you know has been strangled by an abuser, there's a very real, very high likelihood that the abuser will either seriously injure or kill you or the victim you know in the future. Please take strangulation seriously, as it's one of the clearest red flags there is. It's never okay, and it's never not a big deal. Ignoring it may have fatal consequences. And although the study I cited deals specifically with women as victims, it's safe to say that anyone of any gender or age being strangled is an indicator that their life may be at risk.
Abuse on its own is a big enough red flag, but when you couple it with strangulation, the odds are not in your favor at all, and you definitely need to take action with it.
Definitely.
There are resources available to help you. The National Domestic Violence Hotline, their phone number is 800-799-7233. Again, 800-799-7233. They're available 24/7. They have multiple different languages,
including English and Spanish.
Yes. If you need help, please reach out.
Definitely. Now that we've said all this to you all, I wish I could travel back in time to 2017 North Carolina and say it to the prosecution involved with the charges against Becker we just described, because unfortunately, the alleged strangulation was not, in my opinion, taken seriously enough. The felony assault by strangulation charge and the simple assault charge were both dismissed by prosecutors. Becker was found guilty of the least serious charge, communicating threats, but it was a nonviolent misdemeanor offense, and he received no jail time, only a year's probation. The incident resulting in those charges and the disappointing legal outcome had occurred in March of 2016. Things were finally settled in court in July of 2017, and just a month prior to that, in June of 2017, he'd settled other charges against a different woman. That woman had been a 37-year-old girlfriend, and by the time Becker had assaulted her, they'd been dating for 6 months. Also, by the time of the assault, she was pregnant.
That is next-level trauma.
Just when you think you can't get any lower. And by the way, being pregnant also raises a woman's likelihood of being abused by her partner. That is a very well-studied statistic. So when it comes to the assault of his pregnant girlfriend, Becker was found guilty. It had been a simple or misdemeanor assault charge, though, and those rarely carry a lot of jail time. He was sentenced to 30 days incarceration and given credit for time served prior to the matter being resolved in court, which meant that by the time he was sentenced, he was actually free to go. The very next day, the victim, who had not spoken to him since the assault, gave birth to their child. She told the Charlotte Observer that he did not ask to see the baby. Now, public records indicate that after wrapping up these legal issues, Becker opted for a change of scenery. He relocated to Indiana, where, as best I could determine anyway, by reviewing publicly accessible court records, he hasn't been charged with anything more serious than traffic infractions. Meanwhile, back in North Carolina, Sarah is still badly missed by the family her murderer tore her away from. Her brother John told reporter Alexa Ashwell for WSOC-TV that, quote, "Sarah was something special. She was fun to be around. She had a personality you wouldn't forget. This whole thing has brought a big black cloud over our family. Some days I'm mad, some days I'm sad, and some days I'm just in complete disbelief over what actually took place. We're just waiting for justice and wanting to understand the facts." End quote. At the time of this recording, Sarah's family has been waiting on justice for just over a decade. In 2016, a Davidson police lieutenant spoke to WBTV News and told them, quote, "There is so much evidence to assemble with this investigation, but at the end of the day, we only get one shot at it." End quote. He also said, quote, "We're very close to bringing this to a closure." End quote. For whatever reason, though, that closure has not come yet. It sounds like investigators are close to having what they need. Maybe someone out there has a last vital piece of information to help them finally close the case. If you know anything about the murder of Sarah Long, please contact the Davidson Police Department at 704-892-5131. And if you found this episode to be of special interest, you may want to check out our episode on the unsolved homicide of Laura Cecier. Her case is not related to Sarah's, but like Sarah, she's believed to likely have been murdered by a financially motivated significant other with a history of alleged violence against women. So far, though, investigators haven't been able to prove it. We aired our episode on Laura's case in October of 2024. You can scroll back to then in our feed to listen if you'd like.
That's all for this episode of Last Seen Alive. Thanks for listening. Make sure you check out our website, lastseenalivepodcast.com, for photos from the story and links to the sources we used to write it. While you're at it, follow us on Insta and Twitter at LSA Podcast. Episodes of Last Seen Alive air every Monday. See you then. And if you think bringing unsolved cases like Sarah's to the public's attention is important, please take a moment to rate or review Last Seen Alive and tell your friends to check us out too. We'd really appreciate it. And don't forget to check out our merch store where you can get an LSA t-shirt or hoodie. We donate 50% of the proceeds from every sale to the DNA Dope Project. Last Seen Alive is written and researched by you, Leah. Audio engineering and editing is provided by me, Scott.